At 0418 hours local time, 38 Ukrainian strike drones lifted off in a staggered sequence from concealed positions west of the contact line and turned east toward occupied Luhansk. Their primary target was a railway bridge spanning a river crossing along the main logistics artery connecting the Luhansk and Donetsk sectors. Every piece of heavy equipment, every crate of artillery shells, and every tanker of diesel heading to Russian forces on the Eastern Front crossed this bridge. Destroying it would sever the fastest, cheapest, most efficient supply link feeding the entire southern half of the Donbas battlefield. Ukrainian intelligence had spent 2 months mapping the route. Satellite passes timed to the hour. Partisan spotters counting trains. Electronic intercepts confirming schedules. They knew which hours the bridge carried the heaviest traffic. They knew which radar systems covered the approach corridor. And they knew something else. Something that turned a bridge strike into a 2-part operation that would define the morning. What the Ukrainian planners did not know was that Russia had quietly moved additional air defense assets into the area over the previous 3 weeks. After a string of Ukrainian strikes against supply infrastructure heading into Crimea, Moscow had reinforced critical logistics nodes across occupied territory. The bridge now sat inside a defense network denser than anything Ukraine had faced on this axis before. The first system waiting for the formation was not a missile battery. It was the Nebo-M multiband surveillance radar, positioned 40 kilometers north of the bridge. The Nebo-M operates across VHF, L-band, and S-band frequencies simultaneously, which gives it the ability to detect targets that would slip past conventional single-band radars, including small, low-flying drones with minimal radar cross-sections. Its VHF channel in particular can pick up objects at distances where most air defense radars are still searching empty sky. But the Nebo-M has a weakness that Ukraine has exploited across this entire war. It can see far. It cannot shoot. Its tracking resolution is not fine enough to generate a firing solution on its own. It must pass that data to a fire control radar elsewhere in the network, and that handoff, the seconds of coordination between the sensor that sees and the weapon that kills, is a gap. Ukraine was flying straight into it, counting on the gap to hold. By 0424 hours, the lead drones had descended to 250 feet, pressing into the approach corridor that reconnaissance had mapped weeks earlier. A heavy ground fog sat across the river valley, thick and wet, compressing visibility to a few hundred meters. The fog was not part of the plan. It was better than the plan. For the Nebo-M operators, the formation was a cluster of faint, intermittent returns buried in ground clutter. For the fire control radars waiting behind them, the fog turned those faint returns into ghosts, signals that jumped position, flickered in altitude, and refused to hold a stable track. Behind the Nebo-M's early warning layer, the S-350 Vityaz battery covering the bridge area received the tracking data and swung its 50N6A multifunction radar toward the approach corridor. The S-350 is built to seal the gaps that long-range systems leave open at medium and low altitude. Its 9M96 interceptors are fast, agile, and designed to kill exactly the kind of target now closing on the bridge: small, slow, and low. In theory, the formation should have been engaged at 15 miles and shredded before it reached the river. In reality, the drones were flying at 250 feet inside a fog bank over flat, cluttered terrain. The 50N6A radar is devastating against targets silhouetted against clean sky. Against targets buried in ground return, mixed with reflections from railway infrastructure, power lines, farm buildings, and wet earth, its effective detection range compresses sharply. The radar saw returns. It could not confidently say which ones were drones, which were clutter, and which were the fog playing tricks. The S-350 crew worked the problem. They isolated the strongest returns, built provisional tracks, and launched. 2 9M96 interceptors climbed into the murk. The first found a solid target and detonated its proximity warhead. One drone disappeared from the formation in a flash that lit the fog from inside like a lantern. The second missile chased a return that split into 2 contacts as it closed. One real, one a phantom created by a rain-soaked metal roof, and detonated against empty air. 2 missiles spent, 1 kill. 37 drones still flying. The battery launched again. 2 more missiles. 1 connected. 1 lost its target in the ground clutter at terminal phase and self-destructed over a field. The math was running against the defenders. 4 interceptors for 2 kills, and the formation was now inside 10 miles of the bridge. At the rate the drones were closing, the S-350 had perhaps 3 more engagement cycles before the formation passed into the short-range zone where missile geometry became unfavorable. 4 more 9M96s flew. 2 killed, 2 missed in the clutter. The S-350 had now spent 8 missiles and stopped 6 drones. 32 remained. And they were inside 5 miles of the bridge, entering the zone where the engagement transferred from medium-range missiles to the Pantsir S-1 batteries waiting at the bridge itself. At 0429 hours, the first Pantsir battery acquired the formation at 4 miles. The 1RS-21E fire control radar locked onto the lead cluster, and the crew began launching 57 E-6 missiles at 4-second intervals. The first salvo of 4 killed 3 drones cleanly. Proximity warheads detonating within lethal range in rapid succession. The second salvo killed 2 more and missed 2 that had dropped below 100 feet in the final approach. 27 drones remained. The Pantsir crews were shooting well, but the formation was now splitting. It was no longer a single mass approaching from one direction. It was fragmenting into smaller groups, spreading across the approach corridor on multiple axes, each group at a slightly different altitude. One cluster flew straight along the railway line. A second shifted to the northern flank. A third held back, adding pressure to the tracking process by forcing the radar to classify additional targets without engaging them. When multiple groups appear on different bearings at the same time, a point defense system built to track and engage sequentially is forced to choose. Which group gets the next missile? Which one is the real threat? Which one is just pressure? Every second spent deciding is a second the formation uses to close the distance. The Pantsir batteries kept firing. 3 more drones went down to missiles. 2 more were shredded by 30mm cannon fire when the range closed to less than a mile. 22 drones reached the bridge perimeter. Russia's defense had killed 16 of the 38 drones launched, a 42% interception rate. The crews had fought under degraded conditions, in fog, against low-flying targets buried in clutter, and they had still knocked down nearly half the formation. On any report, those numbers would read as a credible defense. But the 22 that got through were already inside the perimeter, below the Pantsir's depression limits, racing toward the bridge at 100 miles per hour. At 0432 hours local time, the first drones struck the railway bridge. The lead aircraft locked onto the central support pillar where the span met its main load-bearing point and dove. The warhead detonated against the concrete. A shockwave exceeding 100 pounds per square inch tore through the structure, cracking the pillar and displacing the steel span above it. The second drone hit the bridge deck 30 meters to the east, ripping the track bed open and throwing ballast stone, rail fragments, and concrete into the river below. 3 more drones struck the approach embankment on the eastern side, destroying the section of track where the rail bed transitioned from the bridge structure to solid ground. Within 60 seconds, the bridge was no longer a continuous route. One span had shifted off its support. The deck was torn open in 2 places. The eastern approach was severed. The railway line that fed the Donetsk front from the Luhansk rear was cut. And then the mission changed. At 0434 hours, updated intelligence reached the operators. A Russian supply train carrying ammunition, fuel, and military equipment had crossed the bridge less than 30 minutes earlier and was continuing east toward frontline distribution points. If that train reached its destination, its cargo would be in the hands of Russian artillery batteries and armored units within hours. The bridge was already destroyed behind it. But the train was still moving forward, still carrying its cargo, still on schedule. 17 drones remained from the original strike package. Their bridge targets were already hit, and a loaded supply train was rolling away from them down the same railway line. The operators made the call. The remaining 17 drones accelerated to maximum speed and turned to follow the railway tracks east. The bridge was done. The train was next. At 0436 hours, the formation caught up with the rear of the train at a distance of 8 miles. The Pole 21 electronic warfare system covering the rail corridor activated, flooding the area with spoofed GPS signals designed to walk the drones off course. The effect was immediate. 4 drones on the formation's western edge accepted the false fix and began drifting away from the railway line, their navigation convinced they were somewhere they were not. 3 of them flew past their fuel margin over open fields and went down without hitting anything. The 4th corrected late and crash-landed in a tree line short of any target. 13 drones remained. and the 13 had already switched to their fallback. Inertial navigation, combined with optical tracking of the railway line itself. 2 steel rails running east, straight and unjammable, pointing directly at the train. The Pole 21 could lie to satellites. It could not lie to a camera looking at the ground. The train was still moving. A moving target is far harder to hit than a stationary one. A delay of even a few seconds during the terminal dive can send a warhead into the empty space behind a car or into the ballast beside the tracks. So the operators changed the approach. 4 drones broke ahead of the formation and raced past the train, dropping low over the tracks in front of the locomotive. Their target was not the train itself, it was the rail line ahead of it. If the train could not be hit reliably while it was moving, its route would be cut first. At 0439 hours, the first drone pitched down and struck the railbed 400 meters ahead of the locomotive. The warhead tore one rail away from its sleepers and blasted the ballast layer into a crater across the track. The second drone hit beside the first impact point, widening the break and displacing the second rail. In seconds, the track ahead was no longer a continuous route. One rail was bent upward like a broken finger. The other had shifted completely off its axis. The ballast underneath was scattered across a gap too wide for any train to cross. Vibrations traveled back along the rails. Inside the locomotive cabin, the crew saw it, or felt it, and hauled on the emergency brake. Steel wheels locked against steel rails. The screech cut through the morning fog. Hundreds of tons of rolling mass slammed forward under sudden deceleration, each car pushing against the one in front of it. The train lurched, shuddered, and ground to a halt 200 meters short of the brake. It was no longer a moving target. It was a trapped one. At 0440 hours, with the train stopped and the track destroyed ahead of it, the remaining 9 drones began their attack runs. The train's onboard jamming system was pressing hard against the video downlink, breaking the operator's screens into patches of static, flickering shadows, and momentary glimpses of rail and steel. The operators flew on what they could see: the direction of the tracks, the shape of the car silhouettes, the car numbers loaded into the mission plan, and on what they could feel through the inertial system when the screen went dark. The first drone struck the locomotive. The warhead detonated against the engine compartment, severing fuel lines and destroying the control systems. Fire erupted from the nose of the train. The locomotive was dead. Even if the track ahead were somehow cleared, this train would never move under its own power again. The second drone dove into car number 3, a fuel tanker. The shaped warhead punched through the thin steel wall and the diesel inside vaporized on contact with the blast. A column of orange flame erupted from both sides of the car and burning fuel spilled onto the ballast, spreading along the rails in both directions. The temperature in the burning zone climbed past 800 degrees Celsius within seconds. The third drone targeted car number 8, deeper in the train. This car held crated ammunition, 152mm artillery shells stacked in wooden boxes. The warhead ripped the car open and drove hot fragments into the storage area. Within a minute, propellant charges began cooking off. The steady, rhythmic detonations, one shell, then another, then 3 at once, shook the entire train. 2 more drones struck car number 13 in the train's rear section, where mortar rounds and military supplies were concentrated. The first warhead cracked the car open. The second drove into the gap and detonated inside the cargo space. The ammunition ignited in a chain that ran car to car toward the rear, each detonation feeding the next, each fire finding more fuel. By 0445 hours local time, the train was burning across its full length. The locomotive destroyed. Car 3 engulfed in a fuel fire spreading along the ballast. Car 8 in continuous ammunition cook-off. Car 13 and everything behind it consumed in a chain of secondary explosions that showed no sign of stopping. Heavy rain was falling across the area, but it could not compete with fires fed by diesel, propellant, and burning ordnance. 38 drones launched, 25 destroyed or lost across the full gauntlet. The S-350, the Pantsirs, the Pole 21's GPS denial, and the train's own jamming. 13 reached their targets across both phases. First the bridge, then the train. Russian soldiers from the escort detail had jumped from the cars and taken cover in ditches on both sides of the track, firing rifles into the sky at drones diving at 120 miles per hour. It was brave. It was also, against targets that small and that fast, almost entirely futile. The window for a rifleman to aim at a diving drone and fire an effective burst was measured in seconds. Most of those seconds were already gone by the time the sound of the engine reached the ground. What remained on the railway line was a blackened locomotive, split and burning cargo cars, rails warped by heat, ballast scattered by explosions, and a supply route stopped dead. The bridge behind the train was broken. The track ahead of it was torn open. And the train itself was a chain of fires stretching along the railbed, its cargo, fuel, ammunition, equipment, burning where it sat instead of reaching the units that needed it. But the real damage was not in the wreckage. First, Russia lost the supply line. The railway connecting Luhansk logistics to the Donetsk front carried far more cargo per day than the available road alternatives. When the bridge is damaged and a loaded train is burning on the track, everything behind it stops. Replacement cargo must be rerouted by road, slower, more expensive, more vulnerable to ambush and further drone strikes. Every hour the railway is offline is an hour that artillery batteries on the front line sit with shrinking shell stocks, and armored units burn through fuel reserves that aren't being replenished. Second, the blocking maneuver changes the equation. Hitting a moving train is hard. Hitting the track ahead of it and then striking it while it sits motionless is a method. Repeatable, teachable, and applicable to any stretch of rail in occupied territory. Russia now has to defend not just the trains but the track itself, the bridges, the switching points, and the approach corridors. That spreads an already strained air defense network even thinner, pulling Pantsir batteries and electronic warfare systems away from the front line to guard logistics infrastructure in the rear. Third, Ukraine demonstrated that the supply chain itself is the target, not the soldiers in the trenches, not the tanks on the front line, the system behind them, the rails, the bridges, the junctions, the trains that keeps those soldiers fed, armed, and fueled. When that system is cut, the pressure on the battlefield doesn't disappear in one dramatic collapse. It fades, slowly, steadily, in ways that are hard to see from a command post in Moscow but impossible to ignore from a firing position that has run out of shells. Destruction is burning a train. Paralysis is burning the train, breaking the bridge behind it, and tearing the track ahead of it, so that nothing moves in either direction until a recovery operation clears the wreckage, rebuilds the railbed, and repairs the bridge. And every day that process takes is a day the front line lives on what it already has and nothing more. If you found this analysis useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown. And leave your answer below. Which logistics route do you think Ukraine should cut next? The rail lines feeding the Donetsk front, or the land corridor supplying Crimea? The answer tells you which war Ukraine thinks it needs to win first. Goodbye.